Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight harder, it's to walk away, not in defeat, but in quiet rebellion. There comes a point when the noise around you becomes unbearable. Opinions, expectations, the version of you everyone else built, and you realize if you want to change your life, you have to disappear for a while. Not to escape, but to finally meet the person you were always meant to be. Step 1. The power of disappearing. There comes a time in every person's life when the noise becomes too loud, when the opinions, the expectations, and the chaos of everything around you begin to drown out the quiet voice inside that's been trying to guide you all along. It's in that moment you start to feel an ache, a pull towards something you can't quite name. You feel the need to disappear, not to hide or to run away, but to reclaim your peace, your clarity, and your power. Disappearing isn't about quitting life, it's about stepping away from the version of it that's been built on everything false. It's the realization that sometimes the only way to find yourself again is to remove yourself from the noise entirely. We live in a world that glorifies being seen, being productive, being busy, being everywhere, all the time. But when your identity becomes too tied to how others see you, you start to forget who you are without their gaze. You start living for applause, for recognition, for validation. And before you even notice, you've built your entire sense of worth around being visible. That's the trap. Because real growth doesn't happen under the spotlight. It happens in the dark, when no one is watching, when no one is clapping. Disappearing is about pulling yourself out of that constant performance. It's about giving yourself permission to stop existing for other people and start existing for yourself. When you disappear, people won't understand. They'll question your silence, your withdrawal, your sudden need for solitude. Some will take it personally, thinking you're rejecting them. But disappearing isn't about them, it's about you. It's about choosing yourself in a way that doesn't always make sense to others. It's the courage to detach from the roles you've been playing, the friend who's always available, the worker who never says no, the person who's always holding it all together. You step back because you finally realize that the version of you that keeps showing up for everyone else has forgotten how to show up for yourself. The power of disappearing lies in the stillness it brings. When you step away from the noise, you start to hear things you couldn't before. The sound of your own breath, your thoughts, your truth. You start to notice what feels heavy and what feels right. The world slows down. The constant rush to be somewhere, to be someone, starts to fade. And in that stillness, you begin to rebuild. You begin to see how much of your life has been shaped by expectation rather than authenticity. You begin to understand that transformation isn't something that happens when you're surrounded by people. It happens when you're alone with yourself, confronting the parts of you that you've ignored for too long. Disappearing is an act of quiet rebellion in a world obsessed with attention. It's choosing peace over performance. It's walking away from the places, people, and patterns that keep you small. And it's understanding that sometimes the only way to truly move forward is to step back completely, to vanish long enough to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. Step 2, isolation versus loneliness. There's a quiet misunderstanding that runs deep in most people's minds. The idea that being alone automatically means being lonely. But isolation and loneliness are not the same. One drains you, the other restores you. Loneliness is a hunger for connection, a deep ache that comes from feeling unseen or unwanted. Isolation, on the other hand, when chosen with intention, is an act of power. It's the space where you stop searching for external validation and start listening to the truth that's been buried beneath constant noise. Isolation is not emptiness. It's the fertile ground where transformation begins to take root. When you first step away from the world, it can feel uncomfortable. You reach for your phone, scroll through meaningless distractions, crave the background buzz of conversation, anything to fill the silence. That discomfort is withdrawal. You've spent years being overstimulated by the presence of others, conditioned to equate constant connection with safety. But when you choose isolation consciously, something begins to shift. The silence that once felt heavy starts to feel sacred. You begin to see how much energy you've given away trying to stay relevant, seen, or understood. You realize how much of your life has been shaped by other people's opinions, and how rarely you've paused long enough to ask yourself what you actually think or feel or need. Loneliness, in contrast, is the byproduct of seeking connection from a place of emptiness. It's when you depend on others to fill a void that only self-awareness can heal. It's what happens when you're surrounded by people but still feel disconnected, because you've abandoned yourself in the process of belonging. Loneliness hurts because it's rooted in lack. It's a reminder that the connection you crave with others is only as deep as the connection you have with yourself. That's why isolation, though often misunderstood, can be one of the most healing experiences of your life. It allows you to meet yourself again, without the filters, without the noise, without the need to perform. In isolation, you start to remember what you actually enjoy, what makes you curious, what feels peaceful. You begin to slow down enough to notice how your body reacts when you're at ease versus when you're forcing something. You start to identify the relationships that drain you, the habits that numb you, the thoughts that sabotage you. You realize that stillness isn't empty. It's full of information, full of guidance, full of truth. You start to trust your intuition again because you've given it room to speak. The very thing the world fears, being alone, becomes the thing that saves you. There's a freedom that comes with chosen isolation that no amount of social validation can replace. It's the space where you stop begging for attention and start building self-respect. You stop chasing comfort in the presence of others and start finding strength in your own company. You begin to understand that the difference between isolation and loneliness lies in intention. One is rooted in avoidance, the other in awareness. One makes you smaller, the other helps you expand. And once you experience the peace that comes from being truly at home within yourself, solitude no longer feels like punishment. It feels like power. Step 3, breaking your identity loop. Most people don't realize how much of their life is lived on repeat. The same patterns, the same choices, the same stories replaying in slightly different forms. Relationships that look new but feel familiar. Habits that promise change but lead to the same emptiness. It's not coincidence. It's identity. The life you're living right now is a reflection of what you believe about yourself. Every action, reaction, and decision comes from the image you've built of who you think you are. And that image becomes a loop. You keep experiencing what aligns with it, even when you say you want something different. That's why transformation requires more than motivation or discipline. It demands that you break the identity loop, the invisible pattern that keeps pulling you back to the same place no matter how far you try to run. Your identity is formed by 1,000 tiny moments. The things people told you when you were young, the mistakes you made, the labels you started to wear, the quiet one, the responsible one, the failure, the strong one. These labels become invisible scripts running in the background of your life. You start to live as if they're facts instead of interpretations. You keep proving them right, unconsciously repeating behaviors that match the role you've accepted. Even your pain becomes part of your identity. You hold on to it because it gives you a sense of who you are. It's familiar, and as strange as it sounds, the familiar feels safer than the unknown, even when it hurts. That's why people stay stuck in cycles that no longer serve them. The identity loop offers certainty, not freedom. Breaking it starts with awareness. You begin to notice how your mind constantly seeks evidence to confirm what it already believes about you. If you think you're unworthy, you'll find reasons to stay in relationships that treat you that way. If you believe you're not capable, you'll sabotage opportunities that prove otherwise. The loop feeds on repetition. It needs you to keep reacting the same way so it can stay alive. But when you start observing your own patterns instead of automatically following them, something shifts. You realize that your thoughts are not truths, they're habits. You see that identity isn't fixed, it's practiced. It's a collection of repeated stories you can choose to stop telling. The process of breaking your identity loop is uncomfortable because it forces you to let go of who you've been. There's grief in that. You're not just releasing people or situations. You're releasing versions of yourself that once felt safe. You start to say no to things you used to accept. You stop explaining your decisions to those who don't understand your growth. You create distance from the environments that reinforce your old story. And in that space, a new identity begins to form. One that's rooted in self-awareness instead of survival, in authenticity instead of approval. The moment you stop repeating the same emotional responses, you interrupt the cycle, you reclaim choice, You start to live from intention instead of reaction, and that's where true transformation begins. Step 4, the rebirth in solitude. There comes a moment in life when everything you've built begins to crumble. Not because you failed, but because you've outgrown the person who built it. The job, the relationships, the routines that once gave you comfort suddenly feel heavy, restrictive, and meaningless. It's disorienting at first. You start questioning everything: who you are, what you want, and why nothing feels right anymore. That's the beginning of the rebirth. The quiet unraveling that happens when your soul decides it can no longer live inside the limits you once accepted. And it almost always begins in solitude. You can't be reborn surrounded by noise, by distractions, or by people who keep pulling you back into the version of yourself you're trying to leave behind. Solitude becomes the cocoon, the sacred ground where your next version starts to form. Solitude has a way of stripping everything unnecessary. When you're alone, you don't have the constant reflections of who others think you are. There's no one to impress, no image to maintain, no expectations to meet. It's just you, raw, unfiltered, and honest. And at first, that honesty hurts. You begin to see how much of your life has been built around fear. Fear of being disliked, fear of being alone, fear of failing, fear of change. You see how often you've settled for less because it felt safer than stepping into the unknown. The silence of solitude forces you to confront what you've been avoiding. It brings up everything you've buried under busyness. It's uncomfortable, even painful, but it's necessary, because before you can rebuild, you have to face the truth of what's broken. As days turn into weeks, the loneliness of solitude begins to shift into stillness. You start to find peace in your own presence. You wake up and realize you don't need constant stimulation or validation to feel alive. You begin to enjoy simple things: the sound of your breath, the rhythm of your thoughts, the quiet clarity that comes when there's no one else around. You learn to sit with your emotions instead of running from them. You cry, you reflect, you forgive. You start to see that solitude isn't punishment, it's purification. It's where the false layers of your identity start to fall away. You're not trying to be anyone anymore. You're learning to just be. The rebirth in solitude isn't about creating a new persona. It's about remembering what was always real underneath the noise. You begin to rediscover your values, your boundaries, your voice. You start doing things that align with who you're becoming, not who you were trying to be. The world outside still moves fast, still demands, still distracts, but inside you there's a new rhythm forming. Slower, steadier, more intentional. You realize that everything you were looking for in others, peace, validation, direction, was waiting for you in the silence all along. Solitude teaches you that the end of one version of yourself isn't death. It's the beginning of another, more authentic one. It's in that quiet rebirth that you finally start living, not as a reflection of what the world expects, but as a true expression of who you are. Step 5, embracing stillness and silence. In a world that constantly glorifies movement, noise, and productivity, stillness feels almost rebellious. We are taught from a young age that to matter, we must always be doing. Chasing goals, meeting expectations, staying busy enough to outrun the quiet that follows us. But eventually, that pace becomes unsustainable. The constant doing, the endless scrolling, the need to fill every pause with sound, it all becomes a distraction from the truth you're avoiding. When life begins to feel hollow despite all your effort, that's your soul whispering for stillness. It's calling you to stop, to breathe, to listen, because the answers you've been searching for in the outside world often exist in the silence you keep avoiding. Embracing stillness isn't about withdrawing from life or rejecting ambition. It's about returning to balance. It's about creating space between the chaos and your reaction to it. In stillness, you begin to see things clearly: your patterns, your motives, your fears. You notice how much of your life has been driven by urgency, by the feeling that if you stop for even a moment, you'll fall behind. That's an illusion. Stillness doesn't slow your growth, it grounds it. It gives you the clarity to see what's truly worth your energy. Silence, too, becomes a teacher. When you stop speaking, you begin to hear. You hear the subtle guidance of your intuition, the quiet truths that were drowned out by external noise. You realize how much wisdom is hidden in simplicity, how peace isn't something to chase, but something to return to. At first, silence feels uncomfortable. It exposes everything you've numbed with distraction. The anxiety, the grief, the thoughts you've pushed aside for years. It confronts you with yourself. But that confrontation is necessary because what you refuse to face will always control you. Stillness gives you the chance to sit with what hurts long enough to understand it. You start to notice the patterns that keep repeating, the emotions that surface again and again, the parts of you that need compassion rather than avoidance. And slowly, the silence stops feeling like a void and starts feeling like a sanctuary. You begin to crave it, to protect it, because you see how much clarity and strength are born there. When you embrace stillness, time changes. The rush of constant urgency fades, replaced by presence. You start to live more intentionally, more slowly, but also more fully. You realize how much you've missed by moving too fast, the beauty in ordinary moments, the subtle connections, the calm that exists between thoughts. Stillness teaches you to listen before reacting, to observe before deciding, to breathe before speaking. It softens the mind and opens the heart. It teaches patience, humility, and depth. Silence stops being empty. It becomes alive, filled with awareness, filled with truth. And in that awareness, you begin to reconnect with something far deeper than achievement or approval. You reconnect with yourself, the part of you that doesn't need to prove, to perform, or to chase, the part that simply knows. Step 6. Reappearing as someone new. There comes a point after the silence, after the solitude, when you start to feel something unfamiliar, a quiet strength that wasn't there before. It's not loud or dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's a slow, steady pulse that begins deep within you, reminding you that you've changed. The world hasn't seen it yet, but you have. You've spent time in the dark, peeling back every layer that wasn't truly you, confronting your fears, your attachments, and the parts of yourself you used to hide. You've learned to sit in stillness without needing validation, to find peace in solitude without feeling empty. And now, as you begin to reemerge, you realize that reappearing isn't about returning to who you were. It's about showing up as someone entirely new. Reappearing doesn't mean seeking attention or proving to others how much you've evolved. In fact, it's the opposite. You no longer crave the recognition you once did because your sense of worth no longer depends on it. The external world that once defined you now feels smaller, less significant. You begin to see that transformation isn't meant to be displayed, it's meant to be lived. The people around you might not understand you anymore. They'll notice the difference, the calm in your presence, the clarity in your decisions, the boundaries you no longer apologize for, and some won't know how to respond. That's because your energy has changed. You've stopped operating from insecurity and started moving from alignment, and that shift changes everything about the way you exist. As you step back into the world, things that once excited you may no longer hold meaning. The conversations that used to drain you no longer have a place in your life. You become selective with your time, your words, your attention. You stop trying to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You realize that peace is far more valuable than approval. And though the process of reappearing feels strange, like learning how to walk again after years of crawling, it also feels liberating. You've shed the weight of your old identity. You no longer carry the need to be everything for everyone. You've outgrown the version of yourself that existed only to please, to prove, to survive. Reappearing as someone new means moving through life with quiet confidence. It's not about perfection, it's about presence. It's about making decisions that honor your peace instead of your fear. It's about speaking truth even when it trembles in your throat. It's about knowing when to stay and when to walk away without guilt. You begin to live from a deeper place, one that's not reactive or desperate, but calm, intentional, and free. You understand now that disappearing wasn't about escape, it was preparation. It was the sacred process of unbecoming everything you were never meant to be, so you could return as the person you were always meant to become. When you reappear, it's not to prove anyone wrong, but because you're finally right within yourself, and that kind of transformation doesn't need to be announced, it simply radiates. Disappearing isn't the end, it's the beginning of becoming who you were meant to be. When you return, do it with peace in your heart and truth in your steps, because the world doesn't need a louder version of you, it needs a truer one. And that version is born in silence, rebuilt in solitude, and revealed in strength.